municipal support for this, they begin to think of the possibility of tuition. So I don't disagree that waiving, I heard what you all said, and I think it's great, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
I understand that, and I'm sure you are correct. I also understand that the only email I've received in the last 2 days on this subject was somebody saying, I can't believe you're going to privately fund public education. So, I'm just saying, let's take what I think is a very short period of time and get our act together before we step off this particular edge.
Okay, let's start to wrap this up.
Just very briefly, I think Karen and I are both point persons somehow because we go to a lot of meetings, and so I get a lot of emails, and I get a lot of phone calls from parents I've never met before who are in Belmont when kindergarten is getting ready to start. Can I tell them that I am relatively confident that the school committee is going to allow for there to be full-day kindergarten, either paid or non-paid, that it's a pretty good chance that there's going to be a full-day K program at the elementary schools next year?
In a word, no. You can't tell them that until the school committee votes.
Yeah.
The school committee needs to vote on it. The school committee has the responsibility for
That's
setting
fine.
that policy
And if they
here
want
at
to
the
call me and
table.
tell me what they think, that's
Tell them
fine.
to wait 2 weeks.
No, they're just going to ask you.
Well, and I'll tell them the same thing, so.
I just have a procedural question, which is, it seems clear that around the table, everyone is in favor of the idea of implementing full-day K, and the decision about how it's funded seems to be, the part that needs more evaluation and thought and input. And I would hate for the community to get the sense that anyone at this table really, that they didn't support full-day K, because I think you all do support full-day K. I see it as sort of two separate votes almost, and that's not, because, I could see someone saying, yes, I support full-day K, but then taking a no vote on the funding if it didn't, but that wouldn't, do you see what I'm saying? It would mischaracterize Anne's position if she had to take a vote on a proposal that was for full-day K only if it was funded a certain way that she didn't agree with. Because she really does support full-day K, just not funded through a fee structure. I just see them as two separate messages to the community.
That is true.
I mean, we all voted to support a budget that included full-day K, and there was no discussion from that point of view that any of us was going to argue not to forward the superintendent's initial budget that included full-day K.
Actually, we didn't vote.
Well, okay. But the conversation, it's very clear that the conversations around the table have been, and in fact, I think each one of us tonight at various points in time has said that we fully support full-day K. I don't think that's the discussion.
Okay, administration's clear on what we want in the next 2 weeks?
Yes.
We're done with this topic, all right.
And also, I would add that anybody who thought that he was going to start at 8:50 has had a chance to come in. We managed to get this so long enough that no one can say they didn't miss it because they came too late.
Could I just say
You thought I
one?
was joking about dragging it on.
Can I just say one thing? I just want to thank the administration for bringing this proposal to us, because I appreciate when people think creatively about how to make things work, and I appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Thank you. We'll be back.
We'll still be here.
Good.
You're not retiring? Okay, next item will be further discussion of the FY09 budget.
Well, on this item, it seems to me that we need to open up to the school committee. We talked about this last week at our meeting. We had a warrant committee meeting, and then we had a meeting on Saturday, March 1st. So it seems to me the question is, where do we go from here? As I see it, there are still some items that, using this one-page sheet, which, as I understand it, Paul Solomon suggested to Elizabeth, who suggested to Jerry, and we have it. This one-page sheet, I think, is very helpful for figuring out where we are. It seems to me that what is still out, existing, are the Butler and Wellington elementary teachers added in September, elementary library aides, elementary instrumental music, 17% cut in athletics, 20% cut in student activities, fee, student activities, increase the bus fee 20% to $420 per child, and then cuts in non-salary accounts, textbooks, non-tech equipment, technical equipment, and buildings and grounds. Now, it's not clear to me what's going to happen in terms of the medical insurance rate. I think Angelo thought that there may be money available that we could reduce our rate from 7% to 4 or 5%. It appears that Phil Curtis does not feel comfortable with that. So I don't know what kind of advice we're going to get on that, and we really want to know fairly soon. But the other, taking the lab tuition credits, it seems to me is a thing that we can do.
My understanding, and again, I'm not at the warrant committee table very frequently, is that the issue whether the rates could be, the budget for rates could be lowered was one question, but Angelo always seemed to indicate that we are substantially ahead of schedule in building a reserve in the self-insurance account. And it was also another way of looking at this, that some part of that surplus could be put into the budget, which, I mean, that's the second method of saying that your health insurance costs go down for budgetary reasons. Of course, it is yet another example, if that were the case that were followed, of a one-time, non-renewable amount of money going in to prop up the FY09 budget, because by definition, that surplus wouldn't be there in subsequent years. So that there are two ways that it could proceed. The first of those, if we could lower medical rates even 1%, and what was it, $100,000 per percent it could be lowered?
50/50.
50, okay.
50
yeah,
for us.
okay, it's not a great amount anyway. That at least would in fact be, it's something that could legitimately be put into ongoing savings as opposed to one-time savings, which has been my leitmotif, as you all know, ad nauseum, for the way this budget's been put together.
Right. So we're left with that, and even if we were able to get the full 7 to 4% reduction, what's still out are library aids at the elementary level, $67,000. Elementary instrumental music, $80,000. It's a, seems to me a very important part of what we do. And 17% cut in athletics, 20% cut in student activities. We're meeting with Jim Davis tomorrow. Pat and Jerry and I are meeting with Jim to talk about what this might look like and what some of the cuts might be. And I guess what we can do is always consider an increase in user fees, athletic user fees, but we just increased those last year. Mm-hmm. So, once again, we're getting to the argument that we just talked about, how public is, or how private is public education.
Is it worth a discussion of prioritizing what's here in case we get
I think it would be, and I think that we need to continue, maybe have a meeting with the Board of Selectmen to talk with them a little further about if there are any other, sources of funding that they think might be available. That we've done that in the past, where we've met with them either at their meeting or our meeting to talk further about that.
I'm sorry, I have a quick question and an observation. The quick question is, should that door stay open? Is everybody comfortable with it being open on a climate control basis? There's still a sign on the door saying that we're in session, and somebody would be inhibited by that.
It is a little chilly.
Okay, great. I didn't know whether somebody had opened it because they were too warm.
Yeah.
And the observation is that there's a very distinguished and much revered person sitting in the back row tonight.
Does that mean we're not going to come?
Well, you, John.
No, I would just encourage any members of the audience to have thoughts about the implications or impact of any of the possible cuts, to have a chance to make their voice heard when the moment arrives for them.
I could weigh in on my own family's personal experience with the elementary music program and their experience of my daughter in this school. So you are the Mr. McClellan, is her favorite teacher in the entire world. She would not. Make sure the camera's rolling.
It's digital, it doesn't roll. It just
Or for music. She said she'd be having a miserable time at Chenery if it were not for music.
Well, thank you.
You're suggesting we cut a fifth grade teacher?
Well, you've embarrassed your daughter. Where are you going to go tonight?
Is there any way you could rephrase that? Still compliment Joan?
Good thing we're back to action minutes.
It makes her experience at the middle school here, the music program. That's a credit to the whole program, not just to you, of course. It comes back all the way back to third grade when she started there. Kimberly.
I said this on Saturday, but I'll say it again. clearly, I have two children in this music program who adore the music program. They both play 2 instruments now. There are 4 teachers teaching 700 children music in this town. I mean, if we throw that out for $80,000 and start them later, and if anyone's never been to one of their concerts, you should go and listen to these kids. Once they hit high school, we should be paying good money to see them. They're unbelievable, and it would be such a shame to sacrifice that. We all know musical education supports math and science education, that there's direct benefit, and I can't believe that these 4 teachers are so great. I can't believe we would let those 700 children be sacrificed for that, for $80,000. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Leslie?
Excuse me, I don't know that everyone has a marked up copy because not everyone sat here for 5 hours on Saturday. But it would be helpful to me, and Jerry may know this off the top of his head, and my markings may be accurate, to put a number on each of these as we discuss them as
The
well.
number is on page 2 of the exhibit
Okay,
A.
does everyone have that too?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So Jerry, part of the discussion on Saturday about the lab credits, can you refresh for me what we are already using of the lab credits, just looking at the left side of the sheet, and what is, in fact, total of that?
Okay. Let me take a step back to the budget that was presented back in mid-January. At that point, we had committed to $60,000 of lab credit because the available balance in our lab accounts was winding down. Since then, including what's on the left side of the sheet, we are now committing an additional $100,000, which is going to come out of the recently declared dividend of $325,000. So we're up to using a lab credit of $160,000. With the remaining dividend, there's still $225,000 remaining. If we go to the right-hand column on the sheet and use still a second $100,000, that would take us up to $260 committed to FY09, leaving $125 in the bank, so to speak, for FY 2010.
If we went that route, would it be worthwhile to get, say, the warrant committee to make a resolution saying they will back us to make up the shortfall in the following years, since we were borrowing against the future, essentially?
Well, I've actually wondered if the warrant committee would even support us using that additional $125,000, because they have been an advocate for being very careful about one-time money. And I know Mike Woodmer was very strongly supportive of us making sure that we smoothed out any
Yep.
kind of use of one-time money. And so I'm
That's not totally true. They got us to eat down the other revolving accounts.
But they did it in a measured, careful way over a series of years.
Okay, 3 years.
So I don't know. I'm just, I'm wondering.
And I think I'm wondering the same thing. I mean, I think certainly there's, the charge we have been given is to close the gap. I don't see a way to close the gap by chewing away at other parts of the, at eating away at more textbooks and more other things. So the only way to close that I can foresee is to try and find more funding rather than more cuts. And so I'd be interested to know, because clearly at least part of the Board of Selectmen wants us to use all of those funds, even though they are one-time funds. I'm not saying I'm in favor of that. I think we've done what we should in terms of smoothing that out. And at the same time, I also understand what the pressures are. That's not going to close the gap, even using all of those funds. We're not going to close the gap. But is it? I hate to use the term politically correct, but is that one of the things that we need to do in order to have done our due diligence to close the gap? I don't know. I'm asking that question of us as a group.
I think John was the one at the Saturday meeting pushing on the issue that if we don't have a successful override this year, And we're using all these one-time sources of funding from both the town's free cash and our own lab credits. That what we're doing is we're really building up the size of the override that's going to be needed next year for the 2010 budget. I don't think we need a special commitment from the Warrant Committee to make up the loss of the lab funding that we'll have next year, because it'll be in the bottom line in the budget. We will have a level service budget, which the available revenue total will not be able to fund, and there'll be a tremendous gap, and this will be one piece that contributes to it.
I was going to try to clarify some of what I think, particularly the chair of the Board of Selectmen was asking us to do, which was to take that additional $125,000, use it now to push off that override, because that gap is going to be so huge next year, $4.5 million, that this little $125,000 isn't really going to make a difference then, but would make a difference if the goal was to postpone an override
Right.
for a year.
Right. Clearly that was the intent. I think the problem is that doesn't close the gap. I mean, so it's a little bit of a moot point whether it's this year or next.
I've got a curiosity, since I had to leave the subsequent meeting. I mean, I was in the audience when you and Elizabeth were at the table along with whatever members of the Warrant Committee, didn't have to go home and walk their poodles, and the Board of Selectmen. Is there anything else that I need to know about in terms of the conversation between the Selectmen and you folks in particular, in terms of any charge they might have given us or any other alternatives they might have offered that they'd like to hear us come back with?
Well, basically they said they left it up to, it felt like they were going to leave it up to us to determine whether they would go forward with an override, an operating override. That's the way it sort of felt. I'm not sure if it was that explicit. Yeah.
What I heard was that it's going to take a couple of weeks anyway until we know whether we can make that health insurance adjustment or not. There's a meeting with Cook and Company financial advisors set for March 17th. Until that meeting happens, until we have some more numbers in, we won't be able to make that decision. So there's going to be a lag as we wait to find out whether or not we can make the adjustment in the health insurance. During that time, the Board of Selectmen would like us to be looking at our budget and trying to find a way to close the gap. Trying to find a way, as Dan LeClaire put it, to calm the waters. It was originally from Dan's prepared statement that and then it was put into the conversation from there. But as they were trying to make their decision about whether, it was clear that it was unwise to put the road stabilization fund override on the April 7th ballot. They would like to put it on, mid to late May, early June ballot. But not unless the waters have been calmed. So they would like us to calm the waters, either by finding the money to close that gap, by doing things like using that $125,000 dividend that's left, by changing other assumptions, whatever we may decide within our budget, find some way to close that. And if it is getting ourselves to a point, even if we can't close it all the way, getting ourselves to a point where we can at least feel like we can live with the cuts that are left on the table. And if we cannot get to that point, then we can come back to them and recommend to them that they consider putting an operating override on, again, a mid to late May, early June ballot.
For the schools?
No, it was very clear, at least Selectman Ferenzi made it very clear that if an operating override were to go on that ballot, it would have to be an operating override that took care of both the town side of the ledger and the school side of the ledger. It would not be one that would just be and additionally, it would be one that would address the overall, the underlying structural gap. That, and it would have to be for, it would have to be a multi-year solution. There was no way that it was going to be just, if we were going for it, it wasn't just going to be to cover what the schools needed for the rest of this year.
Or for next year?
For next year. The figure that Angelo was throwing around, I think, was 3 million, yeah. So they left it to us during this lag time, while we wait to find out if we can change those health insurance assumptions, to figure out whether we can close our budget by changing some of our own assumptions, or whether we want to come back to them and suggest that they consider putting an operating override. In which case, 2 of the 3 selectmen said it would go on with the the $2.5 million road stabilization fund as well. There was lots of discussion about sequencing, and Selectman Leclerc was a little uncertain about whether that roads override should go on at the same time, because his top priority is absolutely the Wellington School. He doesn't want to do anything to jeopardize the Wellington School, and he's not sure yet whether putting an operating override and a roads override would, in fact, jeopardize the Wellington. His gut feeling is that it would. So he wasn't ready to say, although the other 2 were, that it would have to go on with a roads override.
Could you, as a revenue-raising item for the public schools, sign on as a stringer for the Citizen Herald, write up these things, and donate any money you get to the school operating budget? I don't think there are 3 people in all of creation that have a better, anyway, I'm editorializing, but thank you, that's very helpful.
Thank you, Ann, that was great.
Accurate,
So I've
too?
been thinking about that conversation. Your summary was great.
Okay.
I've been thinking about that conversation on Saturday, and one of the things I've been thinking about is, if we were to try to raise revenues to pay for these things that are still out, assuming, we can make the medical insurance change, assuming it's a $100,000 additional lab credit. We'd be talking fees for instrumental music, fees for athletics and activities, increase in bus fees, and then I'm not sure what we do with the non-salary accounts. Now, that's a lot of fees, and it gets back to the public and public education question. I did want to just say that I have had parents come to me and ask me about the freshman sports program next year. Parents are worried about that and tell me explicitly they would rather pay a fee than see the freshman sports program cut. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you, Ann, that was all very helpful. And the other thing I remember, just brief comment on an earlier suggestion that the school committee meet with the selectmen, which I think is a wise idea, but my understanding, my memory from the meeting was, you specifically asked Mr. Frenzy if there would be any more money forthcoming from the town. He said no. But I don't know if he meant according to what they're looking at right now, but my impression was it's on us. I mean, I think it's always wise to have a meeting, but I don't think we can think, well, if we meet with them, they may have in the meantime found $50,000 or $100,000 or $200,000. It was, no, so I just want to make sure that's on the
Other than
table.
maybe this health insurance savings?
That was, but, a discussion was, I thought John had said. do you think there'd be
Actually,
any more help?
Elizabeth asked that
Oh, Elizabeth
question.
asked, would there be more help from the town, and the answer was no. So I think that's on us. But the other point I wanted to make was that I'm never 100% clear where our authority or responsibility as a school committee ends and operations begins. But certainly, I would much prefer, back to the athletics, instead of the elimination of an entire grade, that there be a 17% cut across all athletics, so that there's a bite. I mean, that may be jumping into operations, which I don't, it's not my intention to do. I think I'm going to try to be careful about that role, but certainly as a policy, it would be devastating to have an entire grade of kids not have any sports. And I think down the road will affect sophomore sports, junior sports, and senior sports. So I would strongly prefer, and happen to be at 3 different functions, Saturday and 2 on Sunday, where that was very strongly expressed. It's like, look, why should freshmen have to deal with this? Why not cut 17% across the board in a much more equitable way? Just as an aside, while I have the floor, several people also approached me saying, if you're going to not be able to find the money, and I don't know how you're going to find the money, just do it all together. I'd rather get hit once and then know what's gonna happen and move on. But this was people with kids in schools, people with kids not in the schools, and people without kids.
Right, do we, which,
If we are unable to find the money, people who watch the whole series of meetings on Saturday, that they would rather see, instead of a series of overrides,
our big,
a big in May, two-question schools, roads operating.
rip the Band-Aid off.
Right, instead of talking, this was the best quote I thought, instead of talking about it, just do it, was what I heard from a couple of different.
Anything else at the table? Just, I'm gonna do Jerry first.
I'm unclear about these statement from Mr. Frenzy about if we have to have an operating override, why it needs to be $3 million. I understand that's based on the long-term spreadsheet that the Warren Committee's been working with for the last couple of years in terms of the structural deficit. But we need basically $500,000 to bring back what's still out existing on the right-hand side of the column, assuming that we can make a change in medical insurance aid rate. And the town needs $350,000 if they want to restore street lighting and the other cuts that they made. It seems to me that the larger the override you put on the ballot this year, especially if there's going to be a $2.5 million roads override on the same ballot, the more likely you're predicting a defeat for that override vote. And I just don't understand the logic of putting something out at a level that almost guarantees defeat when it's far in excess of what our needs are to get by for one more year.
Then I think the sentiment at the table was, a year from now, you'd be in the same spot having to ask the voters, whereas
A lot of communities take a different philosophical approach and go for more frequent, smaller bite overrides. I know that had been in the past when I was there, and continues to be the case in Concord. And they have a very high success rate, rather than waiting once every 6 years and putting a big number out in front of the taxpayers, which has a big one-time impact on the taxes.
Yep,
So there are different philosophical approaches to this.
Yeah, I talked to a Concord School Committee person last week who said exactly that. Every 2 out of 3 years, they do a small one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the point is that option doesn't exist for us right now because we've waited for 6 years. That if we put a small one on next year, that does. If we put a small one on for FY09, that doesn't mean we get to put a small one on for FY10. We've got a $4.5 million gap, and so to add yet another override to the 3 ballot questions that already need to happen didn't seem to make sense to the selectmen. That if we were going to put that question out there, let's just do it. And Angelo did in fact say he wasn't sure if 3 million was the right number, and that there needed to be a process to determine what the right number would be, but that was the figure he was throwing around.
Gretchen?
I agree with what Jerry said entirely. I do think we need to change the whole philosophy of overrides in this town and move towards more frequent, less costly overrides, because it helps people sort of plan accordingly instead of having large jumps in their taxes. They have sort of a consistent increase. But when Ann said about there being a structural gap, it's true because we've been using all these one-time monies for the last 2 years or longer, 6 years, of limping along. But I just want to say, if you ask children, and by the time children get to be 13 and 15, they have pretty clear ideas about their experience in education. And you say to them, well, they're going to be eliminating elementary music. Both my girls, one in middle, one in high school, said to me, they can't do that. That's going to screw everything up. The kids won't be ready. They're just going to mess it up. It's going to just ruin it. They'll get to middle school and they won't be ready, and they can't catch up. You can't catch up at a certain point. You don't go out to become you don't take on certain tasks at age 45 and think you're going to become like a skating star or something. There's a reason you start young. And the same thing with the athletics program in the high school. It's like if you don't have the freshman sports, or if you don't have the year of experience, then you mess up your JV and your varsity teams, and you exclude a lot of children from the program in general. And it just doesn't make sense. And I don't want to limp along another year. I think we've limped along, and we've cut and cut and cut. And you can charge fees for athletics, and you can charge fees for instrumental music. But again, that would then take it out of the school day, or move it to the end of the day for the music program, and that would mess everything up. And I don't know how you maintain keeping the existing teachers, because that's beyond their contract time, and I don't know how that would even function and still be the quality program that it is. But I can't do that for classroom teachers. And we are looking at really large classroom sizes. At the Wellington, third grade, and the Butler, for those 2 classrooms that you added teachers this year that you are not going to be able to refund those, you don't have a mechanism in place to supplement, paying for staff through fees. And there's a reason for that. We just cannot continue to say, oh gosh, they're afraid of putting an override on, they want their roads, so we better just give them the roads and live with this. We cannot live with this any longer. And I think that you have every right and a tremendous amount of support to go forward and say, we deserve to support the quality of education in Belmont, and we intend to do so. And yes, we're going to ask for the override.
Okay, Kimberly.
I don't know where to throw this in, so I'll throw it in now. When I listened I've been to every meeting for the last week, and I've listened to the warrant commission, I've listened to the selectmen, I've listened to everyone present, the town side was presented, the school side was presented numerous times. When the town side presented, there were things in the town's budget that they cut that weren't cuts. They were things that weren't going to come up again anyhow. And we didn't get that choice here. We're losing teachers, and we're losing really important things. And I just don't think that this has been as balanced as it should have been from the beginning. And I'm probably going to get yelled at for saying that. But I was really disappointed when I heard them say that the overtime hours for the firemen and the policemen was not going to be there anyhow, because we've trained all the policemen that were using extra overtime hours. But it was a big chunk of their cut, and we're really being brutally honest here at what we're about to lose. And I'll be honest with you, if you take those library aides away, again, I know I keep saying this, but you're wasting money by taking $20,000 out, because you have so many mothers and fathers who are librarians now in our libraries. Taking away one aide in elementary school, you're losing more than one aide. You're losing the whole library system. And asking parents to pay for athletics, and asking parents to pay for student activities, and to pay for kindergarten. I know you've heard this, but it's a lot of money. I had a guy sitting next to me at one of the meetings who said he couldn't afford to pay more for the bus. They already pay more than they could afford. And instrumental music, I would say, how are we going to make it a fee-based program? I mean, how can we keep that teacher? Going back to what Ms. Walker was saying, you're asking how specific can you get about your choices? Like how detailed? Can I tell them that don't do it in freshman year for sports, do it across the board? Well, you should be asking the question, can we even ask for fees for instrumental music and retain those teachers if we're not really supposed to be paying for teachers as parents? So I guess my point is, I think you should just say that we can't do anymore, and that this is as far as that we can't take this away. You just can't.
Will you put the warrant meeting tomorrow night?
Please.
Is it real short?
Really short. Just one thing that might be a solution, if someone from town meeting were to do an amendment to an article and say, I want to take $455,000 from something else and put it just towards schools, which would address this drastic difference between the schools and the towns and what gets cut, and then follow up with an operating override, could we do that both in the same year? Operating override that would take care of the big deficit, but also somebody who would do an amendment to an article that could get right there at town meeting, because not for nothing, a lot of town meeting members are now parents that are very concerned about the schools, which is why they ran and got elected. And there has been some talk about it, that the vote actually, or that it might be supported by more than 50% of the people there. It would address this cut, get all the great people back that we might lose, and but still put an operating override on to cover this big deficit that we have every year that we're borrowing from the free cash and for the overlay fund and things like that. Can anyone answer that for me?
Jerry?
I think Ann has put two different thoughts out there where it'd be either or.
It has to be either or?
You could, any town meeting member could amend the budgets that are on the floor.
This is zero sum.
And you could amend the school budget up, pick another line item in somewhere else, and then vote to amend that down by an offsetting amount. If you're successful in doing that, then town meeting still has a balanced budget, and there's no need for an override. However, you can also take the approach of amending the school budget up without saying you're going to take it from any other town account. The warrant committee would then say, well, we can't convene town meeting, we can't adjourn town meeting because we do no longer have a balanced budget. And then they would be back to the selectmen as to whether or not they then wanted to put an override on the ballot so that town meeting can be adjourned.
And it could only be for that amount then, too?
Yes, it could only be for that amount. I mean, you're mixing and matching two different approaches.
You can't do both.
No, because one still leaves you with a balanced budget that doesn't need an override. The other definitely requires an override to be able to adjourn town meeting. But then the selectmen can still choose to do what they want and say, no, we're not going to schedule it. Go back into that high school auditorium on a hot, sticky night in June when the HVAC isn't working very well and hammer it out. So.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Chair, I have a procedural observation and I'd like to make a request. Procedurally, if we're going to have a public hearing vote on the 25th of this month, we're both going to have any increases in the revenues as they're now known if we go with the current scenario. And we're going to have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how we, combine fees, cuts, manna from heaven to make that all work. So that's some of the work we may have cut out for us. We won't be meeting next week, but the week after we may have to be prepared to do a lot of that sort of thing. And I would encourage folks at this table to think about those areas. I also, as the members of the school committee know, and the public will shortly, I also have a specific proposal that I would like to introduce to the school committee for an override for this spring. And I would like to see whether it meets with sufficient approval at the school committee table or consensus or whatever to take it on to the other parties, the warrant committee and or the selectmen. But I'd like to request a 5-minute break first, just so I can get a breath of air.
Okay.
That's all right.
We'll be back in, we're going to say 5 minutes.
Great.
Do we mean 5 minutes?
Well, it's up to you. You're the one with the elastic watch. Just to go through this quickly, because I was saying this to the members of the school committee, not for discussion purposes, but just to give them a chance to review it before tonight. After Saturday, it was clear, both from the way that, the sort of conversation that Ann is summarizing, and the issues that I had tried to raise with respect to the fundamental problem of using one-time money to fill a gap for this year, only to make the gap that much worse the following year, and to fill that subsequent year's gap would require a very, very large override for which to be nothing more than just simply filling a gap. So I put together this proposal for 3 ballot questions affecting property taxes, and I'm going to make everyone ask their indulgence while I go through these things. My opening premises for making this proposal are that the current fiscal year 09 operating budget contains at least approximately $2 3/4 worth of $1 million in one-kind time non-recurring funds, surplus free cash, and assessor overlay surplus, not including lab credits or other sorts of things that we could be applying on our own. Yet it falls short, as has been acknowledged, of funding level service town or school budgets. The structural gap between anticipated recurring revenues and anticipated recurring expenses for town and school level service budgets, as we define them, was approximately $1.5 million in fiscal year 08, plugged in by free cash. is approximately $3.1 million in FY09, the upcoming budget, which we've already heard cannot be entirely plugged with one-time monies, and is likely to grow to approximately $4.5 million in fiscal year 10. That's just simple arithmetic. The Pavement Management Committee recommendation is for a $2.5 million in additional spending on a roads program beginning in fiscal year 09, the year upcoming, in combination with $1 million in road spending that's provided every year by the capital budget through the spring 2001 override, for a total of $3.5 million a year. This is the basis for the $2.5 million road stabilization fund override that the selectmen were discussing on Saturday, in which they ultimately opted not to put on the April ballot. Okay. 3 property tax increases: a roads override, as just discussed, a debt exclusion for a new Wellington Elementary School, bless you, and an operating override. It seemed to be agreed by all parties at the table, including all 3 members of the Board of Selectmen, that those 3 property tax increases are going to be necessary investments within the next 12 to 15 months. The issues were sequencing and not hitting the voter with too many things at one time. Of the 3 ballot questions that are listed here, the one whose timing is least within Belmont's control is the Wellington debt exclusion, which must take place within 120 days of state approval for partial funding reimbursement. So again, a structural gap will grow to $4.5 million next year. This year's budget has a structural gap of $3.1 million, which cannot be filled through one-time spending, while a roads override would go on the ballot. My proposal is to invert the series of items that have been proposed using the same dollar totals and do them in a different and, to me, much more logical sequence. The sequence would go as follows. Everyone gulp. A $4.5 million override this spring in May or June after our town meeting presentation and as much propaganda / information as can be generated both with town meeting members and the public at large. This override, like the roads program, would be designed to be a multi-year operation override, just as Chairman Ferenzi asked for. One of the things that's bothered me the most about the preparation for this year's budget conversation is that the roads override has been billed as a long-term plan, while there's been no attempt to make any sort of long-term plan, in my estimation, for operating expenses. In fact, all parties acknowledge that we're simply papering over and plugging in as best we can this year in order to defer an override, because putting 2 on the ballot at once would be a bad idea. Okay, so a $4.5 million override passed by the voters this spring, I would propose be divided something like as follows. $3 million in fiscal year 09 would go for the operating budget. The remaining $1.5 million would be put towards the backlog of capital budget projects that has been growing every year, and John and Diana both served on that committee. They can attest to the frustration in not being able to attack those capital budget items because there's never enough money. In the second year, fiscal year 10, $3.75 million of that $4.5 million would go to the operating budget, because of course our expenses are increasing, and $750,000 would go toward the backlog of capital budget projects, which again is being totally unaddressed at this point. In fiscal year 2011, $4.5 million for the operating budget. I argue that this should be the override that goes on the ballot this spring, and not the roads override. So the question is, how does one pay for a coherent and well thought out roads program that everyone of the selectmen and the warrant committee unanimously supports? For that matter, I support it as well. My answer is to back out $2.5 million of the one-time funding for free cash and assessor overlays that is an unsustainable part of our current revenue for the fiscal year 09 budget, and instead spend it on the roads, just as was done with a substantial portion of the free cash in last year's budget when we had $5.2 million of free cash to start with. That way the roads program becomes funded from day one, just as it would have been had this roads override been put on the ballot on April the 7th, as the selectmen had hoped to do. All right. The second ballot question then will be the Wellington debt exclusion, which we all know will happen sometime in 2008, depending on when we hear back from the state reimbursement agency. They will partially reimburse us for the Wellington. My hope would be, both for expense purposes, because we wouldn't have to do a special election, and for getting the best cross-representation of the public, that it could be held in the November general election, but that's kind of out of our hands. And all parties with these 3 questions have said, this is the one that we can't fully predict. Then, assuming successful overrides, successful ballot questions, these first 2, the third would come back to the voters the following year and say, you've given us, for the first time in 6 years, an operating override. That operating override is being designed to last 3 fiscal years. You've also allowed us to fund the roads program for fiscal year 09 through free cash. We now, a year from now, the regular election in April of 2009, would ask then for the $2.5 million roads overlay override that would then go on permanently. Again, this current, the proposed fiscal year having been funded through free cash as it was last year. So, by inverting two numbers, $3 million, Chairman Ferenczi said we needed for this year's structural deficit, and $4.5 million that we would need next year to fill the same structural deficit with no additional enhancements. By inverting those numbers and asking the voters to roll the dice with us, here are some of the things that we accomplish. A fuller funding of the level service town and school budgets for this upcoming fiscal year that we currently have. A 3-year plan for an operating budget that would eliminate the need to ask the voters for operating overrides in fiscal year 10 or fiscal year 11. A capital budget backlog reduced by $2.25 million, which is more than an entire 1 year's worth of spending. I'm sorry, we can only put about $1 million into these backlog projects. We have, in effect, almost triple the amount of money that we put into reducing this over the next 2 fiscal years, while smoothing out the impact on our operating budget. The roads program will be fully funded for fiscal year 09, and assuming that override passed, next year will be funded for all years thereafter. One of the concerns, remember, of the selectmen in not putting that override on the ballot for this April was the fear that it would not pass if sufficient numbers of people preferred an operating override instead. The one-time non-recurring funding, all of it, the free cash, the accessor overlays, all these things that the selectmen have worked so hard to cobble together to try and make our gap less bad than it seems, would all be removed from the fiscal year 2009 budget, which is a budgeting and financial planning strategy, is a much more responsible way to attract the voters. And finally, a $4.5 million override for fiscal year 09 would provide multiple benefits, all of which I've just gone through in breathless prose. A $4.5 million override deferred until fiscal year 10, which is the current thinking of the Board of Selectmen and the Warrant Committee, merely plugs what would then be a structural gap with no reduction in the capital backlog and no contribution to additional needed funding for the operating budget in the subsequent fiscal years. So, again, these numbers are my proposal because they take the numbers that are currently in play and work with them as best possible, so that the total cost to the taxpayers, assuming that all these overrides and ballot questions pass, would be identical either way. Someone could say, well, you really need $3.2 million for the operating budget. Okay, then you could reduce the capital budget backlog by perhaps a bit less. But the fact is that it is possible, by inverting our thinking, not only to use the same dollar figures for these 3 ballot questions with much better outcomes, but also to have a much better foundation for our operating budgets, not just in the coming year, but for the several years thereafter, while reinforcing to our voters that we know what we're doing both with the roads and with our plans for an ongoing operating budget. This, of course, under the assumption, which has been underlying all this, that all parties fundamentally want to maintain as close to level service as possible, and cuts to level service should only happen if the voters tell us that they should. All the more reason to think about having the operating override sooner rather than later. So, anyway, my colleagues had the advantage of 24 hours to look at this just so they wouldn't be having to write notes furiously as I talk at 100 miles an hour. I think the logic of this, to me, is relatively internally coherent. I'd be very interested in people's reactions, and if it or some variation you can propose of it, meets with approval, the question would then be, where might it go from here? But at a minimum, this is something we can say to the selectmen, if you will like, that we have as an alternate way of doing things, which is one of the things they asked us for on Saturday.
Thank you. That was very informative. And did you suggest going to the Warrant Committee first or the Selectmen first with this?
Well, I thought about one of the Selectmen because they were the ones that asked us to think about this. But they're not meeting next week, as far as I can tell. At least there's nothing on the calendar. They're not meeting until the 17th, at which point they'll have the discussion with the health insurance folks. And quite frankly, I don't know if 2 weeks, given how little a window there is to figure out what in the world we're doing with the operating budget, I'm not sure that's the 2 weeks that we can afford to let elapse. I also think that members of the Warrant Committee who have raised, both on last Wednesday night and Saturday, many of these same concerns about deficit spending, structural deficits, one-time money being put into operating budgets, the capital backlog. I think these are attributes of this idea that would resonate, some of them with some members, some with others, but I think a lot of the concerns that I've heard when I was on the Warrant Committee 5 years ago, many of which have not gone away in the meantime, I guess it was 4 years ago, have not gone away in the meantime. I think I would be very curious to hear their reaction to this overall structure, again, even if the numbers had to get fudged a little bit.
So I think I did say at the warrant committee table 2 weeks ago, why don't we do the operating one first and do the roads that are used free cash for
Uh-huh.
roads?
And what objects were thrown at you?
Just the usual eye rolling and like some subset of them. Didn't hear a lot of support, although I didn't hear the immediate whipping that I would have heard months ago. So, I mean, the warrant committee has been inching over closer to accepting a operating override this year because we need the money, and it does close the gap sooner, which is always good.
Yeah.
I think it's a very different thing to just kind of raise that question at a
That
warrant committee
wasn't nearly
meeting
as well thought out as
than
it is.
to bring a clearly articulated plan to the warrant committee. And I would recommend that that's what we do, that we bring this
Tomorrow, you mean?
as soon as possible, right, bring it tomorrow. And the chair of the Board of Selectmen sits on the warrant committee, so you're presenting it to at least one member of the Board of Selectmen as well.
John, one of the things I've been struggling with as I try to think about an override is that, we don't want to just solve the problem for this year. We want to do, as Scott is suggesting, to solve a longer problem, because realistically, as much as we might like to think, well, we do a little one here and we do a little one there, that it would take a sea change in the way the town had done things in order to do that. And I've been thinking in my own mind, well, what you want is to pass an override that's big enough, but that you only use in pieces. And what I'm quite pleased about with this is the idea that, we pass the override, we actually use those monies, but we use them in two different ways. We don't say, well, now we have $4.5 million, so we can do whatever we want with the operating budgets. We continue to have conservative operating budgets and also be able to get at, you're absolutely right, Scott, sitting at the capital budget committee table is incredibly frustrating because you want to be able to fund many more things than we can actually fund in any given year. So, to me, this is very different, I think, from saying, well, we want a $4.5 million override. This actually gets at how are we exactly going to use that money and not just say, well, all of that is automatically going to go into the operating budget, because this is much easier to sell to people because it's structured and it's thought out. And it doesn't give us carte blanche to spend $4.5 million this year and not have, and not think about the future and how we want to do it. So I'm quite happy, on my part, to say, please present this to the warrant committee.
Will you be available tomorrow?
Oh, hell no.
You've got to do it.
No, absolutely. I just want to point out that there's nothing original in this proposal. I mean, the idea of getting a larger amount and parsing it out over years and using the surplus funds for one-time expenditures like capital is one that came from the whole Blue Mega Group process, led by Will Brownsberger and adopted by many people, warrant committee, capital budget, school committee, sitting around that table. There was a point a few years ago where the only argument was, well, do we assume a 4% increase in overall town spending per year or 5%? We were that close to figuring out a literally multi-year plan which would include these capital projects as well as timely overrides in a sort of a smoothing way. And why that whole dynamic fell away, I don't know, but I was always struck by the way of asking the voters for this big bite, the opposite of Congress approach, but it's been 6 years. And then telling them that we would husband it over a period of time so that we would not have to come back to them right away. You'll recall, having worked on the 2002 override, how much fun it was to go back to the voters when you'd gotten an override for $3 million the year before, $1 million for schools, 1 for roads, 1 for town, and say, you know what, we need another 2.4. Again, half of which we couldn't even invest because the state in 2002 took away $1.2 million to offset half of what we just raised our own taxes in the 2.4. And it's been 6 years with no overrides for operating purposes since then.
You've pointed to Will Brownsberger's slides from town meeting. Did that spell that out very clearly? I didn't get a chance to look at those.
That was the presentation of the overall plan, which
Okay.
Scott is referring to.
So that is like nicely spelled out in the slide deck.
I just want to say, one of the things I appreciate about your plan, Scott, and I do appreciate you putting the time and thought into this that you did, is that you are giving consideration to how to move forward with people trying to face up to the responsibility the town has to the roads and to the operating budget. And you're providing a suggestion for how we can accomplish both those things this year in a way that hopefully would be palatable to the taxpayers, because then the long-term override vote for the long-term funding for the roads would come down the road. And I appreciate you keeping that whole package intact as you put this proposal forward.
Well, thanks. I think this stands a better chance of getting broad support among the groups that would need to support it, if it's clear that it's something that's structural and benefits all the various constituencies that find themselves at loose ends with operating budgets and capital budgets.
Yeah. Could I just say one other thing, sort of off the subject a little bit, but not completely? Last night I was at the Wellington School with Dr. Missel and Dr. Holland, and a number of people presenting about Wellington, and the question did come up from parents, we're ready for a new Wellington school, will the town approve it? And so I appreciate also the fact that, you've thought about the Wellington School in this proposal, because that was something that I know I spoke up and reassured people that everyone in town is on board with supporting the Wellington School, the rebuilding of the Wellington School, as part of this process of looking for overrides.
Okay, process-wise, should we email this to the warrant committee tomorrow? And say, hey, Scott, the school committee would like to talk about this? Or Scott would?
Well, I mean, I guess if the school committee, and, no one's asked the question, well, what if the override fails? But if the school committee, thinks that this is worth sending on without, substantial modifications, then yeah, sending it either to Phil to be forwarded, or, however, the warrant committee, distributes that stuff. I would certainly be available to walk through it at a somewhat slower pace tomorrow night, because it's late, we got, other stuff going on. We seem to have plenty of other copies, because I made plenty to give to the public tonight, which is, we always like to give documents to the public when they're being discussed. It's just sort of a funny thing we have. But anyway, however that would be distributed through, whether it's through Barbara Hagg or through Tom Younger's office or through the warrant committee, whomever. You already have this electronically. By the same token, if the school committee says, let's throw this out there and see who else salutes, I for one would be very interested to see what sorts of reactions, positive and especially negative, this would get. Because I can't think of many scenarios in my mind, and I'll still keep thinking about this, that put the town in a better position than this one. At least none of the ones I've heard discussed so far.
Yes, and it's concise, nicely organized, and addresses all the concerns.
And if it doesn't pass, sorry.
It steps back in a way that nobody else has done yet to fully articulate a plan for how it could all fit together. And I think giving it to the warrant committee so that they can have that overall plan before they actually have to sit down, and that they can have a chance to look at it themselves and digest it a bit before it's presented to them would be a good idea.
Okay, so should I send this to Phil and Barbara? And say,
Yeah,
we'd like to talk about this?
Just say the school committee approved this. I know you're having a budget discussion tomorrow night. I'd like to request that this be part of the conversation. It's Phil's prerogative. It's the warrant committee's meeting.
Yep.
But I can't imagine that something like this would be, rejected out of whole cloth.
Okay.
Should it also be sent to the other two selectmen that don't normally sit at the warrant committee table? Or just present it to the warrant committee to see what they say first?
Given that the selectmen are the ones that have to put something on an override ballot, I think carboning them would not be, I don't think anybody would take offense at them being carboned.
They'll see it soon
just
enough
on an
anyway.
FYI basis,
Might as well,
exactly.
for the courtesy, give it.
Right. Even if it doesn't survive the vetting and, beating up or whatever they would undertake tomorrow night, at least they should know that an override proposal, which they asked us for, at least one has come forward. If it's the right one, we'll find out, but at least it's something that's on the board, something to react to.
Yeah.
I think it's important to let the warrant committee know that this is the proposal that we would like to recommend, but at the same time, we will continue with the other process of
Oh, yes. Because
make it clear to them that we are doing also our due diligence on going back through the budget and looking for assumptions that can be adjusted, or any of those possible things they're hoping that will be, that the selectmen are hoping will be able to.
Okay, cool. Really quick?
Yeah, this is so responsible, and it would be so great if it came from the schools to the warrant committee to show that you're all trying. I just think that's the word to describe it. It's a responsible presentation of you know, a suggestion that, if that's what they need to hear from the schools. It always seems to be a little bit back like this, so.
Well, thank you. I mean, in the best of all possible worlds, all the parties, the selectmen, the work committee, the school committee, all understand each other's issues and try and work collaboratively to work towards solutions. And I feel fortunate to have been around this process long enough to have a pretty good understanding as to what some of those needs, especially these capital needs, how they've been building, and trying to put us on a fiscally responsible footing. I think it's the town has a real opportunity here, and I hope that this meets with a good reaction, or that if somebody comes up with an idea that's even better. I have no pride of authorship other than just trying to, put things into a context that gives us all a long-term sense of how we can go forward.
So when you're done the school committee, do you want to be on the warrant committee again?
Haven't I suffered enough? One change I think I would like to make on the bottom where it says proposed by Scott, I think I'd like to change it to accepted by school committee, and I'll send that to you.
Okay.
Or you can amend it, I guess. Just accepted by school committee would be, I think, the next.
I mean, scratch your name and just say accepted by?
Yeah, accepted by school committee. And just make that change on your electronic version before you send it out.
Okay.